The House of Representatives has announced that it will reconvene for an emergency sitting on Tuesday, February 17, 2026, to consider matters, arising from the recent release of the 2027 general election timetable by the Independent National Electoral Commission. And joining us on the news to discuss this is the Director, Abuja School of Social and Political Thoughts, Dr. Sam Amadi. Good evening, and thanks for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Yes, now we'll dive straight in, where we have, following the schedule announced that the timetable schedule as announced by INEC. How visible is the preparation window now, for political parties or regulators and even stakeholders?
Well, nothing is visible because there's likely going to be a crisis looming in terms of constitutional timelines, and it was avoidable. This act should have passed long ago. Over work started in 2013, 2023, maybe after the election. And so today, by maybe Monday, Tuesday, the conference committee might meet to consider this. So INEC will sit back and review things. Now, the new crisis about whether it falls under Ramadan month and the outcry against it, which is maybe unnecessary, also forces INEC to go back and revise it. So INEC is in a very difficult situation to ensure that the election does not end into a constitutional crisis, because if the timeline, it must, before 150 days, 30 days, all elections must complete 30 days to end of tenure. And so you have time for litigation and everything. So we are walking into a constitutional crisis around timelines because politicians could not prioritize public interest above private interest. And so they created a crisis now where INEC is walking a tightrope, trying to balance the timelines, waiting for what the National Assembly will say finally, which might change the game a lot, and then also dealing with the public who might be picking on Easter, on Ramadan, on different fasts. So we are not in a good place right now.
Okay, but now we know that the former president, now Atiku Abubakar, and other stakeholders have urged INEC to reconsider the date for the 2027 presidential election, citing its overlap with Ramadan. Now, what are your thoughts on this?
I think it's, in my view, with due respect, probably frivolous, because look, we've had elections that fall within the Ramadan. Ramadan is a period, and it's not like a Salah day, particularly. We say, India, most of the top Muslim countries, data shows, have had elections within Ramadan. I think Ramadan is a period, holy period that stretches for some time, and the act just going to vote and coming back should not be a reason why would not in any way contravene the spirit of the Ramadan and its celebration. So oftentimes, because of our too much sensitivity to religion, symbolism, not even the real thing, we worry a lot. I also understand that the time that election fell within Easter itself, the Easter period, and I think the Catholic Conference, Bishop Conference raised issue. In my view, we are in a difficult place to allow INEC to go ahead. Ramadan, a month or so of fasting, people go to work. Most of my colleagues, they go to work, they come back to pray, and then they fast, they go to work, they pray. And so if they're able to carry that routine, just going to vote for a few hours. And again, that's why we keep talking about making the elections easy. So it's just accreditation, then you vote, you go home. And I think perhaps it's not too much to expect of a country that within the holy period, fasting period, people can vote. They don't go for warfare. And so people can go to work, really, and on weekdays, they come and do the Ramadan. Then they can as well, in my honest view, go to vote and come back, and good enough time to also go and perform the religious obligation of ending the fast, which is usually sundown, 6, 7 o'clock. So I think really that this additional pressure may be unnecessary on INEC right now when INEC is dealing with several things. But let's see how INEC resolves, manages this pressure. I mean, I hope we don't fall into guessing days that will be free to Christians and free to Muslims and free to enemies and free to Jehovah's Witnesses have also had issues. I mean, about Saturdays, which is the day they go to church, and the Supreme Court, the matter went to court, and the court says, well, those are not violations of, religious freedom to have public duties or activities on a day that people also identify as holy or identify as having religious symbolism. So I think INEC should really think carefully, and maybe the religious leaders should weigh in and tell the faithfuls that this duty of voting is not incompatible with fasting and may not be very disruptive.
Now let's not assume now that maybe there's a postponement, or let's say there's a shift. What financial implications would it have on INEC and the federal budget allocated for election preparations?
Well, maybe not much, because INEC has not started delivering on that. And INEC just proposed a date, or has ruled out dates. It might mean that INEC would either shift the election slightly more. INEC has about less than 10 days to play with, within the time it has to complete all activities. So INEC might look back, maybe bring it a little bit forward, bring it a little bit further down. So it will affect the planning of other activities. You may not have too much financial sensitivities. What you usually have is, as when the election has been programmed and ballot papers printed and materials committed to a particular day, like we saw in 2015, where because of the crisis in the Northeast then, the government had to, or secret advice, had to postpone election for 2 weeks. It had enormous costs. INEC had to rerun materials, reprint materials. Political parties had to extend their promotion activities, media, but the media that bought media time and media space, they have to pay more and run expenses. But right now, the disruption in terms of financial cost will be minimal, because INEC has not yet started taking the more expensive actions towards a particular voting day. So they could still get back and revise it. But what it will pose more danger is actually timeline. Any INEC has no room to maneuver because of what the Nigerian political leaders have done with late enactment or even non-enactment of the Election Act. So INEC has a tight time frame to make these adjustments. And it will be difficult for INEC, because any change you make will have a triple effect. It has a knock-on effect on other sensitive days. So if you revise A, you have to revise B, C, D, and Z. So that's really going to be a lot of problem for INEC juggling with these timelines. They have to change it again. But financially, maybe not much.
Okay, now on a final note, now how might this public perception of INEC's neutrality, and institutional independence be affected by either accepting or or rejecting the proposal?
Well, if INEC does that through a procedure based on what you call public reason, if INEC entertains this complaint, runs it through a filter that is religious neutral, what you call religious neutrality. Look at, does this really inconvenience people? Let's assume we're not talking about Muslims, we're talking about Christians, we're talking about animists, we're talking about tertiary religionists. Does this, complaint also make sense? If INEC does it, the INEC has to bring a general principle that says any day for election, if it goes contrary to X, Y, Z, we will change. So it becomes a general principle that's not based on the influence of Muslim faithfuls or influence of Christian faithfuls. It's dangerous to have that kind of rational, what we call in liberal theory, public reason. So INEC will fall back to a sense of deference to Islamic religion, which might trigger a sense that maybe INEC is much more influenced by either the prestige or the number or the rhetoric or the visibility of this region, or because of Atiku Abubakar and because a certain person had put their voice. So if I was INEC chairman, I want this by some principle of neutrality, cost-benefit analysis, and then look at really, is there a harm? That's the principle here. Is there a harm, rational, that this timeline will inflict on citizens, irrespective of their religious commitment, if there's no substantial harm, the test of substantial harm. If there's no substantial harm, then INEC should not concede. Otherwise, it could open doors to several other, pressure and advocacies around religious exceptionalism, and that would be difficult for a very rational, religious neutral, regulatory action based on public reason. So this is difficult for INEC. They have to really be sure that they are not pandering to anybody, and that they are convinced that changing this timeline is because there's a real substantial harm. Otherwise, they should stick to their timeline.
All right. Now, thank you very much, Prof, for this brief moment of clarifying and sharing your light and sharing your thoughts, on this scheduling and the timetable being released by INEC.